Get ready for 6 terrifying stories of creatures that mimic human behavior in ways you've never imagined. From eerie encounters with shadowy figures to skinwalkers lurking in the woods, these tales will make you question what's real. In each story, the line between human and creature blurs, leaving you with chills that last long after the video ends. Have you ever experienced something so strange it couldn't be explained? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't miss a second of these spine-chilling encounters. Kylie's haunting night of mimic encounters. Kylie never liked staying at her dad's house in Charleston. It wasn't that the house itself was creepy, it was relatively modern, with the usual quirks of a southern home, but something about her room always made her uneasy. The room had a door behind the bookshelf, one that led to a tiny storage space, barely large enough for a person to stand in. It had always bothered her, though she couldn't quite explain why. The door remained hidden most of the time, but at night, she always felt like something was behind it, watching her. That night, she lay on her bed, the soft glow of the TV casting shadows around the room. The ceiling fan spun slowly above her, creaking slightly with each rotation. The house was mostly quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the air vent, which hummed just above her bed. The sound was supposed to be comforting, but tonight, every little noise seemed sharper, more pronounced. Kylie pulled her blanket tighter around her, trying to focus on the TV, but the discomfort in her chest refused to go away. As the hours ticked by, a soft tapping sound reached her ears. She paused, her eyes flicking toward the bookshelf that hid the small door. The tapping was faint, rhythmic, like someone gently knocking from the other side. She muted the TV, straining to hear. Tap. 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 The sound continued, too soft to be from anything mechanical. Kylie's heart began to race. Her first thought was that it was her dog, maybe scratching at something behind the bookshelf. That had to be it. She relaxed a little, convinced her mind was just playing tricks on her. But then, the tapping changed. It became more deliberate, more insistent, as though someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. Kylie's stomach twisted in knots. She shut off the TV completely, plunging the room into silence, save for the eerie tapping. She waited, hoping the noise would stop, but it didn't. Suddenly, a voice echoed from outside her door, soft and familiar. "Kylie," it called, barely more than a whisper. "Can I sleep in your room?" It was Angela's voice, her younger sister. But something wasn't right. Angela wasn't staying with them tonight, she was at their mom's house. The voice outside her door, though identical to Angela's, carried a strange, hollow tone, almost as if it were mimicking the sound. Kylie's blood ran cold. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and her throat tightened with fear. She slowly got up, her body trembling, and locked the door. The voice continued to call softly, but now it sounded farther away, as if it were drifting down the hallway. Kylie pressed her back against the door, her hands shaking as she gripped the lock, her mind racing with the terrifying realization, whatever was out there, it wasn't her sister. Kylie stood frozen against the door, her mind racing with the impossibility of what she'd just heard. The voice, though it had sounded exactly like Angela's, wasn't real, it couldn't be. She strained to listen, her ears picking up the faint creaks and groans of the house settling. But there was something else, too, a low rustling sound, like footsteps moving across the hardwood floor. The noise was soft but unmistakable. Whatever had been mimicking her sister's voice was still there, somewhere in the hallway. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her trembling hands. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the stress of staying in this room, with its weird noises and creepy hidden door, was finally getting to her. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the fear wouldn't leave her. She glanced toward the bookshelf, half expecting the tapping to start up again, but the room had fallen silent. For a moment, everything seemed still. Kylie tiptoed toward the window, her eyes darting outside into the dark, quiet night. The faint glow of the neighbor's porch light was the only thing visible. She clung to the hope that whatever was happening was just a weird, late-night hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But that hope quickly evaporated when she heard something new, a distant voice from outside, faint but distinct. "Help," the voice called. It was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Kylie's heart pounded. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her neighbor's voice. She recognized it immediately. But just like with Angela's voice earlier, something about it was off. The tone was hollow, distant, almost like it was being played through a broken speaker. The voice repeated itself, this time a little louder. "Help me." Instinctively, Kylie reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she unlocked it. But she hesitated. She knew her neighbor well enough to know that something about the voice was wrong. It was too perfect, too similar to her real voice, but stripped of any real emotion. And then it hit her, just like with Angela, this voice was being mimicked. Kylie's grip tightened around her phone. Whatever was outside was trying to lure her out, just like it had tried to get her to open the door earlier. She stepped back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of confronting whatever was mimicking those voices filled her with dread, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. The house felt colder now, the air thick with an eerie stillness. Suddenly, the tapping started again, this time louder, more aggressive. The sound echoed from behind the bookshelf, where the hidden door stood. Kylie's pulse raced, her mind screaming at her to leave the room. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a kitchen knife she had left from earlier, and backed into the far corner of the room, keeping her eyes on the bookshelf and the door. Outside, the voice continued to call for help, growing fainter with each passing second. But Kylie knew better now. Whatever was out there wasn't her neighbor. And she wasn't about to find out what it really was. Kylie remained in the corner of the room, her knuckles white as she gripped the knife, her breath shallow and uneven. The tapping from the bookshelf door had stopped, but the room was far from peaceful. An oppressive silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the distant buzz of electricity, but everything else felt eerily still. Her mind raced through the events of the night, trying to make sense of the voices, the noises, the chilling presence that seemed to surround her. Every rational part of her screamed that this was impossible, that there was no such thing as a mimic or some kind of supernatural force playing tricks on her. But the fear in her chest was too real to ignore. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside her door. They were slow, deliberate, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was waiting for her to make the next move. Kylie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the door, her heart pounding in her chest, half expecting to hear that voice again. She waited, every second dragging on painfully as the footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, they stopped. Kylie didn't dare move. The tension in the room was unbearable. She strained to listen, but all she could hear was the deafening silence. Her eyes flicked toward the door, her mind screaming at her to stay put, to not make a sound. She wasn't sure if whatever was out there could hear her, but she wasn't going to take any chances. She tightened her grip on the knife, her pulse racing with anticipation. Then, out of nowhere, the tapping resumed. But this time, it was different. It wasn't coming from the bookshelf door. It was coming from the window. Kylie's heart leapt into her throat. The soft, rhythmic tapping seemed almost playful, but it filled her with dread. She slowly turned her head toward the window, her breath catching as she realized what was happening. Someone, or something, was outside, tapping gently on the glass, just like before. But she knew better now. She knew it wasn't her neighbor, just like it hadn't been Angela. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if the entity outside was becoming impatient. Kylie's body trembled with fear. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The window was her only exit, but whatever was out there was waiting for her, lurking in the darkness, mimicking the voices of people she knew. Desperation gripped her as the tapping continued. She couldn't stay here, trapped in her room, waiting for something to happen. She had to act, but every fiber of her being was paralyzed with fear. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension, as if the very walls were closing in around her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, as if the entity had decided it was done playing games and was ready to strike. Kylie held her breath, waiting for whatever would come next. The silence that followed the abrupt end of the tapping was unbearable. Kylie's whole body remained tense, her breath barely escaping her lips as she stared at the window. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, thick and impenetrable, as if hiding something just beyond her view. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the night, each sound and each mimicry, and the dread settled deeper into her bones. She knew that whatever had been out there, mimicking the voices of those closest to her, hadn't gone away. It was still there, watching, waiting. The eerie calm that had settled over the house now felt like a warning, the kind that comes just before something terrible happens. Kylie's grip on the knife tightened, but she knew it was little more than a comfort. Whatever this was, it wasn't something a knife could stop. The house creaked, a deep groan of wood and nails settling, and Kylie's pulse spiked again. Her gaze flicked to the bookshelf, the door behind it hidden once more in the shadows. It was then that she heard it, the faintest sound, like a sigh, coming from behind the bookshelf. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Something was back there. Panic surged through her. She thought about running, but where could she go? She was trapped, the windows and doors offering no real escape. Kylie glanced at her phone on the bed. She hadn't checked it in what felt like hours, too paralyzed by fear to even think about calling someone. With shaking hands, she grabbed it, her fingers fumbling to unlock it. Before she could dial, another sound echoed through the house, a voice. But this time, it wasn't Angela's or her neighbor's. It was unfamiliar, low and distant, but filled with an edge that made her skin crawl. Kylie, the voice called, lingering on her name. It wasn't playful like before, it was mocking, as though the entity knew it had her cornered. She quickly dialed her dad, hoping he would answer, praying he was close by. But the phone rang and rang with no response. The silence on the other end of the line felt like another taunt, as if the house itself was cutting her off from the outside world. The voice called again, this time closer. Kylie. She backed up, her eyes darting around the room for anything she could use to barricade herself. The knife felt useless now. The air had grown colder again, the chill wrapping around her like a vice, suffocating her with each passing second. And then, as if in a final act of defiance, Kylie ran to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening. Silence. Suddenly, the front door rattled. The sound of keys jingling filled the hallway. Kylie's heart jumped as she heard her father's voice from downstairs, calling her name, a hint of concern in his tone. The sound was so normal, so reassuring. But after everything that had happened that night, she hesitated. Was it really him? With trembling hands, she unlocked the door, cautiously opening it. Her father stood in the entryway, looking up at her with confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Kylie's eyes filled with tears of relief. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that whatever had been outside wasn't finished with her yet. The house felt different now, like it was keeping secrets. And Kylie knew, as she looked back at her father, that she would never trust the voices in the dark again. Voices of the dead, Drew's horror. Drew had always felt at home in the wilderness. The dense forests of rural Virginia, especially the Blue Ridge Mountains, had been his playground since childhood. Now, as an experienced outdoorsman, he found solace in the isolation that these remote woods provided. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. That's why, on a crisp autumn afternoon, he packed his gear and headed deep into Piney Grove Preserve for a solo hunting trip. No distractions, no people, just him and the untamed wild. The day had gone as expected. Drew set up his camp in a small clearing, hung his food in a tree to keep it safe from wildlife, and prepared his gear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, he climbed into his tree stand, rifle in hand, ready to wait for the deer to come out. The silence of the forest was calming, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog began to roll in. Drew adjusted his position in the tree stand, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. He felt completely at ease, the forest his familiar companion. But then, something changed. A sound drifted through the trees, a voice. At first, Drew thought it was his imagination. He was deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road or trail. No one should be out here, not this far in the preserve. But the voice came again, this time clearer, carrying a note of desperation. It was a woman's voice, calling for help. "Help me," the voice echoed softly through the trees. Drew's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to call back, to offer help to whoever was out there. But something held him back, an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something about the voice didn't feel right. It was too calm, too controlled for someone in genuine distress. Drew's pulse quickened as he stayed silent, his eyes scanning the dark forest below. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help, please." It was close now, much closer than it should have been for the short amount of time that had passed. Drew's skin prickled with unease. He gripped his rifle a little tighter, instinctively retreating further into the shadows of his tree stand. Every hunter's instinct in him screamed that something was wrong, that he should remain hidden. And then, the voice changed. It called out his name. Drew. His blood ran cold. It wasn't just any voice, it was his mother's. Her voice, clear as day, calling for him from somewhere in the fog. But Drew knew it couldn't be her. She was miles away, safe at home, nowhere near these mountains. Heart pounding, Drew held his breath, frozen in disbelief. Something out there was mimicking his mother's voice, and it knew his name. Drew remained frozen in his tree stand, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice, the one that had called his name in his mother's tone, hung in the air, echoing softly through the trees. His mind raced to make sense of it. He knew his mother was nowhere near the Blue Ridge Mountains, and yet, the voice had been unmistakable. It sounded just like her, the same cadence, the same familiarity. But how? And why? The fog around him seemed to thicken, swallowing the trees and distorting the forest in the dim light. Drew's breath came shallow and fast as he scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. His grip on the rifle tightened. His instincts, honed through years of hunting, told him to stay hidden, to remain quiet. Whatever was out there wasn't human, at least not anymore. The voice came again, this time softer, but still carrying that eerie familiarity. "Drew, come here." It was almost pleading now, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was trying to draw him closer. But Drew didn't budge. He knew better than to respond. Every nerve in his body screamed that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the voice shifted. It wasn't his mother's voice anymore. This time, it was deeper, rougher. It was his father's voice, the same voice he hadn't heard in years, not since his father had passed away. "Drew, come down here," the voice called from below. A chill ran down Drew's spine. His father had always been a towering figure in his life, but hearing his voice now, out here in the middle of the wilderness, filled him with dread. His father's voice was unmistakable, but the tone wasn't right. It was hollow, lifeless, as if the words were being forced out of someone who had only heard the voice but didn't understand how to use it. Drew's mind reeled with disbelief. He hadn't thought of his father in this way for a long time, but now, hearing his voice twisted into something unnatural, he couldn't shake the terror that gripped him. He held the rifle close, ready for anything. His senses were on high alert, but there was no movement below, nothing but the thickening fog. Then, out of the silence, came the rustling sound of something moving through the brush beneath him. It wasn't the graceful movement of a deer or any animal he was familiar with. It was slow, deliberate, as though something large and human-like was creeping through the underbrush. Drew's pulse quickened, his body rigid with fear. He wanted to run, to flee back to his camp and leave these cursed woods behind, but something held him in place. Whatever was below him wasn't going to let him go easily. The male voice came again, now eerily calm. "Drew, it's safe. Come down." His hands shook. He knew it wasn't safe. He knew that if he climbed down from the tree stand, he might not survive what was waiting for him below. but he had to face it, whatever it was. Drew's body felt numb, a cold sweat creeping down his spine as he strained to listen. The rustling below had grown louder, more deliberate, as though whatever was moving through the underbrush wanted him to hear it. He peered down from his tree stand, but the thick fog obscured everything. The woods, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a trap closing in around him. His father's voice echoed once more from below. "Drew, come down here. It's time." But there was no warmth in the words, no trace of the man Drew had known and loved. It was hollow, emotionless, like something was trying to sound human but couldn't quite get it right. Drew gritted his teeth, his heart pounding so hard he feared whatever was lurking below would hear it. He knew he couldn't climb down, not with that thing waiting for him. The rustling grew closer, directly beneath him now. Through the gaps in the leaves, Drew could make out a figure, tall, human-like, but with something terribly wrong. The form moved awkwardly, limbs jerking in unnatural ways, as if it didn't quite know how to move like a person. And then, as the figure emerged from the fog, Drew's breath caught in his throat. It was blank-faced. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface where a face should have been. The figure's head tilted upward, as if sensing him in the tree stand. Drew's grip tightened on the rifle. His fingers itched to pull the trigger, but fear paralyzed him. He had never seen anything like this before, never encountered anything so profoundly unnatural. The figure's mouthless face seemed to shift, as though it were trying to form features, but nothing came. Instead, it simply mimicked the movements of a human, swaying slightly as it stood beneath the tree. Drew's mind raced. What was this thing? Why did it sound like his mother and father? And how did it know his name? The voice came again, but this time, it didn't sound like his father anymore. It was something else, something distorted and wrong. "Come down, Drew. It's safe now." Drew's body trembled. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure, the way it moved in slow, jerking motions, almost like it was trying to imitate human behavior but failing. And then it did something that nearly made Drew lose his grip on the rifle. It began to climb. Its movements were unnatural, too fast for something that should be human. The figure's long arms and legs stretched unnervingly as it latched onto the tree, pulling itself up with impossible speed. Drew's breath caught in his throat. It was coming for him. Without thinking, Drew raised the rifle, his hands shaking, and fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the forest, breaking the eerie silence. The figure stopped for a moment, its blank face tilting as if registering the sound. But then, it continued its ascent, unfazed by the shot. Drew fired again, this time at point-blank range. The figure let out a distorted, inhuman sound and fell back into the brush below, disappearing into the fog. Drew's chest heaved as the figure disappeared into the fog below, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. His hands shook violently, still gripping the rifle, his ears ringing from the gunshots. He strained to listen for any signs of movement, but the forest had gone deathly still. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the fog itself was closing in on him. For a moment, Drew thought he had done it, that whatever had been stalking him was finally gone. But then the rustling began again, slow and deliberate, coming from the brush below. The sound was more ominous now, like something much larger was moving through the undergrowth. His pulse quickened, panic gripping his chest as the reality of the situation settled over him. The shots hadn't killed it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with him. The rustling stopped, and Drew could hear it again, the voice. But this time, it wasn't calling his name. It wasn't his mother's voice, nor his father's. It was a twisted, distorted version of his own voice, calling up from the fog. "Drew, come down." The voice sent a wave of terror through him. He could hear the mockery in it, the way it mimicked his tone perfectly but lacked any real emotion. It was as if the creature was playing with him, testing his fear. His grip on the rifle tightened again, though he knew it would do little good. If 2 shots hadn't stopped it, what more could he do? Drew took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to get out of here. Staying in the tree stand was no longer safe. The thing could climb, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. He scanned the forest below, looking for a clear path through the fog, but the trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches like reaching hands. Then, in the distance, he saw it. His camp. The dim glow of the campfire he'd left burning flickered faintly through the trees, a beacon in the otherwise suffocating darkness. He had to make a run for it. Steeling himself, Drew slung the rifle over his shoulder, his legs shaking as he climbed down from the tree stand. His feet hit the ground, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. He didn't dare look back as he broke into a sprint, the fog swallowing him as he raced toward the safety of his camp. The voice followed him, echoing through the trees, shifting between his own and the distorted versions of his parents. "Drew, come back. It's safe." But Drew didn't stop. He knew what was out there now, and he wasn't about to let it catch him. When he finally reached his camp, breathless and shaking, he grabbed whatever supplies he could and bolted toward the trailhead. The forest was alive with whispers, the fog pressing in on him from all sides. But he didn't stop running until he was clear of the woods, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. Drew never returned to Piney Grove. Whatever was out there, lurking in the Blue Ridge Mountains, had let him live, but he knew it was still waiting. The whisper of Willow Creek's woods. Gregory still remembers the summer when everything changed in Willow Creek. The town had always been small, the kind of place where nothing much happened and kids could roam free without worry. He and his best friend, Sarah, spent most of their days exploring the woods on the outskirts, near a large, twisted willow tree that stood like a sentinel at the edge of the forest. It was ancient, its branches gnarled and heavy, with a hollow in its trunk that was just big enough for the two of them to crawl into. The tree had always fascinated Gregory and Sarah. There was something eerie about the way its branches swayed even when the wind wasn't blowing. But being young and curious, they couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. One day, as they played near the tree, daring each other to go inside the hollow space, Gregory heard something strange, a soft whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind passing through the leaves, but the whisper grew clearer, almost like a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably there. "Come play," it said. Gregory froze, his skin prickling with fear. He glanced at Sarah, who had heard it too, her wide eyes locked on the tree. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, a little more insistent. "Come play." The words seemed to echo from within the hollow of the tree itself. Gregory's stomach tightened. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping, all urging them to come closer. Terrified, Gregory and Sarah bolted, running as fast as they could through the woods until they reached the safety of town. They didn't stop until they were back in their homes, out of breath and shaken. Neither of them spoke about it for days, afraid that saying it aloud would make it real. But the whispers didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, other kids in town started talking about the whispers near the old willow tree. Some claimed to have heard voices calling their names, mimicking their friends or family members. Others said they had seen shadows moving around the tree, even in the brightest parts of the day. It wasn't long before the stories spread, and soon everyone in Willow Creek was talking about the whisperer. Gregory and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the tree had something to do with it, but no one dared to go back. The whispers became part of local legend, a tale parents told to keep their children from wandering too far into the woods. But for Gregory and Sarah, it was more than just a scary story. They had heard the voices, and deep down, they knew there was something real behind the legend. Then, one summer evening, a boy named Billy went missing. He had been playing near the woods and never came home. Search parties combed the area for days, but there was no trace of him. The whispers that had once been a strange curiosity now carried a weight of dread. The town of Willow Creek would never be the same. The days after Billy's disappearance were filled with tension. Willow Creek had never experienced something like this before. In a small town where everyone knew each other, the loss of one child felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. People whispered about the whisperer, and though most dismissed it as superstition, the kids who had heard the voices knew better. Gregory and Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the whispers they'd heard near the willow tree, and deep down, they feared that whatever had called to them had something to do with Billy. One night, a week after Billy went missing, Gregory was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The town felt different now, quieter and colder. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something hiding in the shadows of the woods. The image of the willow tree haunted him, the way its branches seemed to move without wind, the hollow in its trunk that had whispered to them. As he lay there, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, he heard it. At first, it was so faint that he thought he was imagining it, but then it came again, clearer. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Gregory," it called. His breath caught in his throat. It was Billy's voice. He shot up in bed, his heart racing. For a moment, he thought it must have been a dream. But then the voice came again, a little louder, a little closer. "Gregory, come play." The words sent a chill through him. He knew it wasn't possible, Billy was gone. But the voice sounded so real, so familiar. He glanced toward his window, half expecting to see his friend standing outside, but there was nothing. Just the darkness of the night. The voice called again, but this time, it wasn't asking him to play. This time, it was different. "I went with the whisperer." Gregory froze, his blood running cold. The words hung in the air, twisting the silence into something dark and menacing. He sat still, listening, his mind racing with fear. Whatever had taken Billy was now calling to him. The next morning, he told Sarah about the voice. She looked at him, her face pale and drawn. "I heard it too," she whispered. "Last night. He called my name." Neither of them spoke about it to anyone else. They knew the adults wouldn't believe them, would just brush it off as nightmares brought on by the stress of Billy's disappearance. But Gregory and Sarah knew what they had heard, and they knew it wasn't just in their heads. The whispers were real, and now, they were coming for them. Days passed, and the whispers only grew louder in Gregory's mind. The town of Willow Creek was still reeling from Billy's disappearance, but Gregory and Sarah felt a different kind of dread. They had heard Billy's voice, and now they couldn't escape the feeling that the whisperer was getting closer, creeping toward them through the woods. They no longer dared to go near the old willow tree, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made their hearts race. One afternoon, Gregory and Sarah sat in their usual spot near the creek, far from the tree but close enough to the woods that they could still feel its presence. They hadn't talked much since they'd both heard Billy's voice that night, but today, the weight of it all was too much to bear. "What do you think happened to him?" Sarah finally asked, her voice low, as if afraid of the answer. Gregory hesitated. He didn't want to say what he was thinking, what he feared deep down. That Billy hadn't just wandered off, that something had taken him, something that was now lurking in the shadows, waiting for them. "I don't know," Gregory said, though he felt the lie in his own words. "But I don't think he's gone." "Not really." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the woods ahead. "I think the whisperer took him," she whispered. "And now it wants us too." The idea hung heavy between them, an unspoken fear that had been growing for days. They both knew that whatever had called to them that night wasn't their friend Billy, it was something else, something far more dangerous. And now, it was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gregory found himself back in his room, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The house was quiet, but the air felt thick with tension. He glanced toward the window, half expecting to hear the whispers again. But the night was still. Then, just as he was beginning to relax, the faintest sound drifted through the air. A whisper, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Gregory." He froze, his pulse quickening. The voice wasn't Billy's this time. It was Sarah's. His heart raced, every instinct telling him to stay put, to ignore the voice. But the whisper came again, more insistent. "Gregory, come play." He knew it couldn't be Sarah. She was at home, far from the woods, but the voice outside his window mimicked her perfectly. Just like it had mimicked Billy before. Gregory's stomach twisted with fear. The whisperer was playing with them now, using the voices of the people they trusted most. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of the woods. The whispers grew louder, overlapping one another, a chorus of familiar voices calling his name. Gregory backed away from the window, his hands trembling as he tried to block out the sound. But it was too late. The whisperer had found them. Gregory's room felt like it was closing in on him. The once familiar walls now seemed oppressive, and the air was heavy with the presence of something unseen. The whispers outside his window had taken on a life of their own, calling his name in overlapping voices, first Billy, then Sarah, and now even the faint echo of his own voice. The whisperer was no longer content with shadows and distant calls. It was here, in the heart of Willow Creek, and Gregory knew it was hunting him. He tried to shut out the sounds, to convince himself it was all in his head, but the weight of the truth pressed down on him. He had heard Billy's voice the night before the boy disappeared. He and Sarah had felt the presence of something unnatural near the willow tree long before anyone in town had started whispering about the whisperer. And now, with each passing day, the entity had become bolder, more persistent. Sarah had stayed home that night, too afraid to leave the safety of her house, but Gregory couldn't shake the feeling that even their homes were no longer safe. The whisperer was creeping closer, slipping between the cracks, using the voices of those they loved to pull them into its grasp. The missing boy, Billy, wasn't the first to vanish, but his disappearance had left a scar on the town. A scar that would never heal as long as the whisperer remained. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the edge of the woods. Gregory's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced out the window, half expecting to see the figure of a boy or a girl standing at the edge of his yard, beckoning him with hollow eyes. But the yard was empty, cloaked in darkness. Only the whispers remained, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere, seeping through the walls and the windows, twisting his memories and filling him with dread. As the hours stretched on, Gregory tried to block out the sounds, but they clung to him, wrapping around his mind like a fog. He knew now that whatever had taken Billy wasn't done. The whisperer would come again, for him, for Sarah, for anyone who dared to listen. The legend of Willow Creek had become all too real, and the voices calling out in the night were no longer just a strange story to tell around campfires. They were the echoes of something far more dangerous, something that fed on fear and loneliness. Gregory lay awake for the rest of the night, unable to close his eyes. The voice of the boy who had disappeared echoed through his thoughts, a chilling reminder that no one was safe. And though the whispers eventually faded with the dawn, the fear that gripped Gregory did not. The whisperer was still out there, waiting, and the town of Willow Creek would never forget the shadow that haunted its woods. The dark watchers of night shifts. Night shifts had always been unsettling for Jake, an EMT with years of experience. The quiet, empty streets and the way shadows stretched long and distorted under the streetlights gave the city a strange, eerie feel. Lately, though, something more disturbing had begun to creep into his routine. After midnight, the air seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. It was during these hours that Jake found himself questioning what he had seen and experienced. On a particular night, after a draining shift, Jake and his partner, Tom, had just dropped off a patient at the ER. The hospital, stark under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, seemed unusually quiet. As they walked toward the ambulance, something caught Jake's attention. He stopped, his eyes drawn to the roof of the hospital. Dark shapes stood motionless along the edge, barely discernible against the night sky. They were tall and unmoving, just silhouettes in the distance, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. Jake's pulse quickened as he realized these weren't normal shadows. The figures stood still, their forms too rigid, too deliberate. He felt an unexplainable chill creep down his spine. Instinctively, he turned to Tom. But Tom didn't seem surprised. The older man barely glanced at the figures, his expression grim and knowing, as if he had seen them before. There was no alarm in his demeanor, just a quiet acceptance of something Jake didn't yet understand. As they climbed back into the ambulance, Jake couldn't shake the image of the figures. They hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but their presence had been palpable, as though they were watching, waiting. He wanted to ask Tom about them, but something about his partner's reaction stopped him. Tom had been doing this for years, longer than Jake, and there was an air of grim familiarity in the way he had handled the sight. Jake sensed that asking about it would open a door he wasn't ready to walk through. The rest of the shift passed in silence, but the unease lingered. The figures on the roof haunted Jake's thoughts. The hospital, a place where life and death intersected every day, now seemed like a place where something darker, something beyond explanation, had taken root. Jake felt as though those shadowy forms were following him, not physically, but in the quiet corners of his mind, always present, always watching. By the time the night gave way to the faint glow of dawn, the feeling hadn't subsided. The shadows, the figures, Tom's silent acknowledgement of their presence, everything seemed to point to a truth Jake wasn't ready to face. He had the sinking feeling that this wasn't the last time he would encounter those figures, and the realization left him with a growing sense of dread. Days passed, but the memory of the shadowy figures on the hospital roof clung to Jake like a bad dream. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, convincing himself that it had been nothing more than an illusion, a trick of the light after a long shift. But deep down, he knew better. There had been something unnatural about the way those figures had stood, so still, so silent, as if they were more than just shadows. The next night shift came, and though Jake tried to put the figures out of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they responded to calls and transported patients to the ER, the hospital once again loomed before him, its roof dark against the night sky. He forced himself not to look up, trying to focus on his job, but the sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. Tom, as usual, remained quiet, going through the motions of the job as though nothing had changed. But Jake could sense it, there was something Tom wasn't telling him. The older man had seen those figures too, but he hadn't reacted with surprise or fear. It was as though Tom had seen them before, perhaps many times. Jake started to wonder how long Tom had been keeping this secret and how many others in their line of work had witnessed the same thing. As the night wore on, a heavy silence filled the ambulance. Jake found himself scanning the rooftops of every building they passed, half expecting to see the figures standing there, watching. But it wasn't until they arrived back at the hospital later that night that the feeling of dread returned in full force. After dropping off another patient, Jake paused for a moment in the parking lot, his eyes drifting upward despite himself. They were there again. The same shadowy figures stood on the roof, their forms unmoving, blending into the darkness like they were part of the building itself. The sight sent a chill through Jake, though this time, he wasn't as shocked as he had been the first night. There was a strange familiarity now, as if the figures had become a part of the hospital's landscape, a dark, ominous presence that existed just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Tom, once again, showed no reaction. He glanced briefly at the figures, but his face remained expressionless. Jake could feel the weight of something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that neither of them wanted to address directly. There was no denying it now, these figures were real, and they were tied to something far more sinister than Jake could comprehend. As they drove away from the hospital, the weight of the night settled over Jake like a blanket of unease. The figures, so quiet and still, felt like harbingers of something darker, something linked to death itself. He knew there was more to them than he could explain, and the idea that they were following him, watching him, left him with a growing sense of dread. The shadows from the hospital roof followed Jake, lingering in his thoughts long after the night shifts ended. During the day, they seemed distant, like fragments of a nightmare he could almost forget. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the memories returned, sharper and more oppressive. There was no escaping the feeling that those figures were tied to something darker, something that extended beyond the hospital's walls. Jake found himself growing more cautious during his shifts. Every time they responded to a call, he scanned the rooftops, the alleys, even the tree lines, looking for any sign of movement, any glimpse of those shadowy forms. It was as if they had become part of the fabric of his world now, lurking at the edges of every scene, just out of reach but always present. He could feel them watching, waiting. One night, after a routine call, the tension became too much. As they drove through the quiet streets, the usual silence in the ambulance felt suffocating. Tom remained as stoic as ever, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but Jake could no longer keep his suspicions to himself. Though he hadn't spoken directly about the figures before, the weight of their presence had become too much to ignore. Tom's reaction wasn't what Jake expected. There was no surprise in his partner's expression, no confusion. Instead, Tom's face hardened, his jaw tightening as if the conversation had been inevitable. The silence stretched between them as Jake realized the truth. Tom knew exactly what those figures were, and it wasn't the first time he had seen them. There was a reason the older man had never acknowledged the shadowy forms openly. He had learned to live with them, to accept them as part of the job. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together what little he knew. The figures weren't just a strange occurrence. They were something much darker, something tied to death itself. Their presence was no coincidence. They appeared near hospitals, around places where life slipped away. And they weren't just passive observers. There was something predatory about the way they watched, something cold and calculating. As the ambulance turned back toward the hospital for another drop-off, Jake felt the familiar chill creep over him. The building loomed ahead, its rooftop barely visible in the dim light. But Jake didn't need to see them to know they were there. The shadowy figures would be waiting, just like they always were. The unsettling realization hit him hard. The figures weren't simply tied to death, they were part of it. They followed the dying, mimicking human forms, blending into the background like they belonged in the world of the living. But they didn't. They existed on the periphery, lingering in the spaces between life and death, drawn to places where the two collided. Jake felt a deep sense of dread settle over him. The figures weren't going away, and now he understood why Tom had never spoken of them. Once you knew they were there, you couldn't unsee them. The realization weighed heavily on Jake as he approached the hospital for yet another drop-off. The shadowy figures on the roof, once a strange curiosity, had now become a dark certainty in his life. He understood now that they weren't just random apparitions, they were tied to the very essence of death itself, haunting places where life ebbed away. They existed in the liminal space between life and death, feeding off the transition, watching and waiting for their next opportunity. As the ambulance pulled up to the ER entrance, Jake felt the familiar dread wash over him. He didn't need to look up to know that the figures would be there, standing silently, observing. The air was thick with the weight of their presence, and for the first time, Jake felt truly afraid of what they represented. These were not just strange shadows. They were entities, mimicking human forms, stalking those who worked so closely with death. He had learned enough from watching Tom to know that acknowledging the figures wouldn't change anything. They weren't interested in being seen or confronted. Their purpose was darker, more insidious. They didn't need to interact with the living because they weren't part of the living world. They were something else, something far more dangerous. Later that night, as Jake drove through the empty streets after another long shift, the reality of his situation sank in. The figures, the watchers, were always there, lingering on the periphery of his vision. He couldn't escape them. Every hospital, every death site he visited, they would be there, waiting. And it wasn't just him. Tom had lived with this knowledge for years, silently carrying the burden of understanding what these figures were. But there was something else Jake couldn't shake, the feeling that these figures weren't just tied to hospitals or death. They seemed to follow him now, always present, even when he wasn't working. The weight of their gaze, the cold, empty feeling that came with knowing they were near, stayed with him, even in the quiet moments of his life. It dawned on him that they weren't simply mimicking the human forms they took. They were watching him, studying him, and perhaps, waiting for something more. Jake began to wonder if their connection to death meant that one day, they would come for him, too. The shift ended, but the fear didn't fade. As Jake lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the shadows of his room seemed to shift unnaturally, reminding him of the figures he could never truly escape. He knew now that his world had changed forever. The shadows had always been there, following the path of death. He just hadn't noticed them before. And now, there was no turning back. The figures would always be watching. The Skinwalker haunting in Ontario. The farm had always been a place of peace for Richard and his family. Nestled deep in rural Ontario, their land stretched out in all directions, bordered by dense woods that seemed to go on forever. Richard had lived there his entire life, taking over the family farm from his father. The isolation had never bothered him until recently. Strange things had begun happening around the property. At first, it was small, faint noises at night, rustling in the trees near the house, things that could easily be explained by the wildlife that roamed the woods. But as time passed, the sounds became more distinct, more deliberate. Richard started hearing footsteps around the barn late at night, too heavy to be from any animal he was familiar with. His dogs, usually fearless when it came to chasing off intruders, would cower and refuse to leave the house when the noises started. One night, as he sat on the porch, Richard saw something that sent a chill through him. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a figure moving at the edge of the tree line. At first, he thought it was a deer, but when he looked closer, it was clear that the figure was walking upright. It darted between the trees, moving too quickly for him to get a good look, but there was something off about its movement, too smooth, too deliberate. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The image of the figure lingered in his mind. He had grown up hearing stories about strange creatures that roamed the woods at night, but he had never given them much thought. Now, those stories seemed all too real. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences intensified. The sounds in the woods grew louder, more distinct. Richard heard what sounded like a human voice calling from the trees, but the words were garbled, as if whoever, or whatever, was speaking didn't quite know how to form them. His family grew uneasy, especially after their animals started acting strangely. The horses would refuse to leave the barn, and the cattle seemed nervous, constantly pacing the fields. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard stood by the window, scanning the tree line. A feeling of dread had settled over the farm, as if something was watching them from the shadows. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something unnatural. Just as he was about to turn away, a loud crash echoed from the barn. Richard rushed outside, his heart pounding. The dogs barked furiously, but stayed close to the house, unwilling to venture into the darkness. As he approached the barn, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He felt it before he saw it, a presence, lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight. And then, from the woods, came the sound of a scream. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human, either. The sound was unnatural, high-pitched and broken, like something trying to mimic a human voice but failing. Richard froze, his breath caught in his throat. Whatever was out there, it wasn't from this world. The scream lingered in Richard's mind long after the sound had faded. That night, he barely slept, his ears tuned to every noise, every creak the old farmhouse made. The woods, once familiar and comforting, now seemed like a dark threat that pressed against the edges of his land. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and Richard knew it was getting closer. The next morning, Richard decided to check the barn and the surrounding area in daylight. His family had grown increasingly nervous, sensing the tension that now hung over the farm. The animals were unsettled, especially the dogs, who refused to leave the house altogether. As Richard approached the barn, he saw the damage from the night before. The barn door had been knocked off its hinges, the wood splintered as though something powerful had forced its way in. He scanned the ground for tracks, but found nothing, no signs of an animal, no footprints. It was as if whatever had been there had left no trace. As the days passed, the eerie incidents continued. At night, Richard could hear strange noises echoing from the woods, branches snapping, leaves rustling in ways that didn't sound natural. But it was the sounds themselves that unnerved him the most, the occasional cry that seemed almost human, but not quite. It was as though something was out there, imitating human sounds, but failing to get it right. One evening, as Richard sat in the living room with his wife and children, the familiar tension filled the air. His wife glanced at him, her worry clear on her face, but neither of them said anything. The kids, though young, could sense that something was wrong. The farm had changed, and the nights had become something to fear. Just as Richard was about to get up, the sound returned, a distant cry from the woods, high-pitched and broken, like someone screaming for help. It froze him in place, his heart racing. His wife stiffened, and the children went silent, their eyes wide with fear. The scream echoed again, closer this time, and the dogs, huddled near the fireplace, began to whimper. Richard knew it wasn't a person, but the sound was too close to ignore. It was almost as if the creature was calling to them, trying to lure them into the woods. The scream was followed by strange cries, almost human, but twisted, as though the creature were mocking the very sounds it had heard from people. It was mimicking, trying to replicate something it didn't quite understand. The realization sent a chill through Richard. Whatever this creature was, it was learning. That night, as the family huddled together, Richard sat by the window, his rifle in hand. The night air was thick with tension, the sounds from the woods growing more frequent, more deliberate. He knew the creature was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come closer. The farm no longer felt like home. It had become a hunting ground, and Richard wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out. The following days felt like a slow descent into madness for Richard. The farm, once a haven of peace and routine, had become a place of constant fear. Every time the sun set, the atmosphere shifted. The nights were no longer just dark, they were alive with something predatory. The sounds from the woods persisted, and the cries continued to grow more unsettling, as if the creature was drawn closer with each passing night. Richard kept a vigilant watch from his porch, rifle always within reach. His family rarely ventured outside after dusk, and even during the day, the farm felt different, more isolated, as if the woods themselves were encroaching on their lives. The animals sensed it too. The cattle, usually calm and docile, became skittish, and the dogs, once brave protectors of the land, refused to leave the safety of the house. One night, just as the last light of the day disappeared behind the horizon, Richard heard it again, a scream from the woods, echoing through the trees. But this time, it wasn't alone. The cry was followed by a series of garbled, distorted noises, as if the creature was attempting to form words. Richard's blood ran cold as he listened. It wasn't just mimicking human sounds, it was learning how to speak. The noises were growing more frequent, more desperate, as if the creature was frustrated with its inability to replicate what it heard. Richard tightened his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding as he peered into the darkness beyond the tree line. He knew it was out there, watching him, testing the boundaries of the farm. He could feel its presence, lurking just beyond his sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, the sound changed. Instead of the broken cries and distorted noises, a voice rang out, clearer than before, almost human. "Help me," it called, echoing from the woods. Richard froze. The voice sounded familiar, painfully so. It was his son's voice. He knew it couldn't be real. His son was safe inside the house, asleep in his bed, but the creature had learned how to mimic his voice perfectly. It was trying to lure him into the woods, trying to draw him out by exploiting his worst fear. Richard's hands trembled as he fought the urge to respond. His instincts screamed at him to run into the woods, to protect his family, but he knew better. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and if he went into those woods, he might not come back. The voice called out again, this time closer. "Help me, Dad." Richard's breath caught in his throat. The creature was learning, adapting, and it was only a matter of time before it came closer to the house. He had to protect his family, but he couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could they survive this? Richard stayed rooted to the spot, his grip tightening on the rifle as the voice from the woods grew louder. The creature, using his son's voice, was no longer trying to imitate, it was trying to manipulate. The sound of his son calling for help was almost perfect, but Richard knew it was a trick. The real danger lay in how convincing the creature had become. It had learned enough to sound human, and that meant it was getting closer, both physically and in its ability to mimic what it heard. The voice called out again, this time from just beyond the edge of the tree line. "Dad, please help me." The desperation in the tone was chilling. Richard felt his body tense, every instinct telling him to protect his family. But he knew the truth. His son was inside, safe with his wife. This voice, this thing, was something else, something far more sinister. Suddenly, the dogs erupted in frantic barking, their growls low and menacing as they pressed against the door, refusing to go outside. The entire house felt charged with fear, as though the creature's presence was suffocating the life out of the farm. Richard stood frozen on the porch, his eyes scanning the darkness, knowing that the moment he let his guard down, the creature would make its move. From the woods came a rustling sound, followed by a series of low, almost human-like whimpers. The creature was no longer mimicking. It was calling, testing its voice, growing more confident. Richard watched as the shadows at the edge of the forest shifted, something moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. He caught a glimpse of it then, a shape, tall and hunched, darting between the trees with unnatural speed. His heart raced as the figure stopped just at the edge of the clearing, its form hidden by the shadows, but its presence undeniable. The air around him felt thick, heavy with an unnatural tension. He raised the rifle, his hands shaking slightly, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, as if sensing that it had been seen, it let out a guttural sound, a blend of a human scream and something far more primal. The noise echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Richard's spine. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cracking through the night. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its figure melting back into the shadows of the forest. But Richard knew this wasn't over. The creature had retreated, but it hadn't gone far. The voices in the woods might stop for now, but they would return. It would wait, watching from the safety of the trees, learning and adapting. And one night, when the time was right, it would come for them again. Richard turned back toward the house, his heart still racing. His family was safe for now, but the farm, his home, had changed. The creature was out there, lurking in the darkness, and he knew it would never truly leave. Chased by the mimicking creature of Ontario. The road leading to the cabin was narrow, winding through dense woods that stretched for miles. Emily and Mark had rented the cabin for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the stress of city life and enjoy some time in nature. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road, and the forest around them seemed to grow darker with every turn. Emily, sitting in the passenger seat, admired the scenery, but there was something about the isolation that made her uneasy. As they rounded a sharp corner, Mark hit the brakes suddenly, jolting Emily from her thoughts. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights, was a coyote. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing eerily as it stood perfectly still. The animal didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the car came to a complete stop just a few feet away from it. Mark honked the horn, expecting the coyote to dart back into the woods, but it remained frozen in place, staring at them with an unnerving intensity. Emily felt a chill creep down her spine. There was something off about the way the coyote stood, almost as if it were studying them. Mark honked again, and still, the coyote didn't budge. After a tense moment, Mark decided to ease the car forward, hoping the movement would scare the animal off. But as the car inched closer, the coyote's behavior became even stranger. Instead of running, it slowly backed up, never breaking eye contact with the couple. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, deliberate, almost as if it were mimicking the way a person might retreat when feeling threatened. The car moved forward a few more feet, and suddenly, the coyote let out a sharp bark, a sound that sent a shiver through Emily. The bark didn't sound right. It was repetitive, almost mechanical, as though the animal were attempting to imitate the sound of a dog but failing to get it right. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood up. This wasn't normal coyote behavior. After what felt like an eternity, the coyote finally turned and disappeared into the woods, moving with a strange grace that left both Emily and Mark silent. Mark pressed the gas pedal and continued down the road, but the unsettling encounter lingered in the air between them. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes, both processing what they had just seen. "I've never seen a coyote act like that," Mark muttered, his eyes scanning the road nervously. Emily nodded, her gaze shifting to the dark woods outside the window. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The way the coyote had moved, the way it had watched them, it didn't feel like an ordinary animal. It felt like something was wrong, something unnatural. and as they drove deeper into the forest, Emily couldn't help but feel that whatever they had encountered wasn't finished with them. The drive to the cabin was quiet, but the tension between Emily and Mark was palpable. The encounter with the coyote had left them both uneasy, and as they navigated the narrow, winding road deeper into the forest, the sense of isolation only intensified. The thick canopy of trees overhead blocked out most of the evening light, and soon, darkness enveloped the road completely. The headlights of the car cast eerie shadows that flickered through the trees, making everything feel more claustrophobic. As they approached the cabin, a small clearing appeared in the woods, and the structure came into view. It was quaint, nestled between the towering pines, with a single porch light glowing faintly. Mark pulled the car to a stop, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence of the forest pressed in around them, the only sound the soft hum of the car's engine. Just as Mark cut the engine, a sound broke through the quiet, a soft rustling from the tree line nearby. Emily stiffened in her seat, her eyes darting to the source of the noise. For a moment, she thought it was just the wind, but then she saw it. A shape moved between the trees, low and fast, darting in and out of the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar form of the coyote. It was back. The animal stopped just at the edge of the clearing, its eyes reflecting the dim light from the cabin's porch. It stood motionless, watching them with the same unsettling intensity as before. Mark froze, his hand still on the door handle. The coyote didn't move, didn't bark, it just stood there, its body tense as if waiting for something. Emily's pulse quickened. There was something deeply wrong about this. Coyotes didn't behave this way. They were skittish, avoiding humans at all costs. But this one seemed almost deliberate in its actions, as though it knew what it was doing. Suddenly, the coyote began to move again, this time more slowly, and in a way that made Emily's stomach twist with dread. It wasn't running. It was walking, almost pacing, as if mimicking the steps of a person. Its head remained low, its eyes never leaving them, but its gait was disturbingly human-like. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance, the fear evident on both their faces. Something about this coyote wasn't right, and they both knew it. Without a word, Mark quickly grabbed his bag from the car, gesturing for Emily to follow him toward the cabin. They moved as quickly as they could, keeping their eyes on the animal, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began following them, matching their pace, its strange, repetitive bark echoing through the clearing. By the time they reached the cabin door, the coyote had stopped just a few feet away, its eyes still locked on them. The strange, almost mechanical barking continued, growing louder and more insistent. Emily fumbled with the key, her hands trembling as the sound echoed in her ears. When the door finally swung open, they hurried inside, slamming it shut behind them. But even with the door closed and locked, they could still hear the barking, and it sent a chill through their bones. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unease. Mark and Emily stood by the door, listening to the strange barking that seemed to echo from just outside. It wasn't the sound of a normal animal, it was too repetitive, too unnatural, like something was trying to mimic a real coyote but failing. The sound grated on Emily's nerves, making her heart race with each eerie repetition. Mark peered through the small window next to the door, his breath fogging up the glass as he strained to see into the darkness. The cabin was barely lit, just the faint glow from the porch light outside offering any visibility. But the coyote, or whatever it was, remained hidden, its presence only betrayed by that unsettling sound. "We need to stay inside," Mark thought to himself, stepping away from the window, his mind racing. He had been in the woods enough times to know how animals acted, but this was different. There was something wrong with the way the creature had followed them, the way it had stood upright, pacing like a person. As the minutes ticked by, the barking eventually stopped, leaving the cabin in a heavy, oppressive silence. Emily exhaled shakily, her nerves still on edge, though she was relieved the sound had faded. But the quiet was almost worse. The absence of noise only heightened the tension, making every creak of the old cabin feel louder, more menacing. Mark moved to the window again, cautiously pulling back the curtain. His eyes scanned the clearing, looking for any sign of movement. For a moment, he saw nothing, just the dark outlines of the trees and the faint light from the porch casting long shadows across the ground. But then, in the distance, he saw it. The coyote was back, standing at the edge of the tree line, its body partially obscured by the shadows. It stood on all fours, but there was something different about it now, something even more disturbing than before. Slowly, the creature began to rise, standing upright on its hind legs, its body shifting unnaturally as it straightened. The sight sent a wave of cold fear through Mark. The coyote, if that's what it still was, stood fully upright, its form unnervingly human-like. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, watching the cabin. Mark's breath hitched in his throat as he backed away from the window, unable to process what he had just seen. Emily, sensing his fear, looked at him with wide eyes. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the weight of the situation settled over them. They were trapped, alone in the middle of the woods, with something outside that defied explanation. Mark's mind raced, searching for a way to explain the impossible, but there were no answers. The creature outside wasn't just mimicking human behavior, it was something else entirely, something they didn't understand. The sound of footsteps broke through the silence, heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving away from the cabin and back into the woods. Whatever was out there, it had retreated, but Mark knew this wasn't over. The heavy footsteps faded into the night, leaving the cabin in a suffocating silence. Mark and Emily stood frozen, listening for any sign of the creature's return, their hearts pounding in the oppressive quiet. The fear that had gripped them earlier hadn't loosened its hold, it had only grown stronger. Mark's mind raced, replaying the moment he had seen the coyote rise onto its hind legs, moving like something that wasn't entirely animal. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. Outside, the darkness seemed thicker, the woods more menacing than ever. The faint glow from the porch light did little to penetrate the shadows, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Even though the creature had retreated, he knew it wasn't gone. It was out there, lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting. Emily paced the small cabin, her nerves frayed. She couldn't make sense of what they had seen. Everything about the encounter defied logic. Coyotes didn't behave like that. They didn't mimic people, didn't stand on two legs, didn't follow humans with such deliberate intent. And yet, that's exactly what had happened. Mark moved to the window again, his breath shallow as he cautiously peered outside. The clearing was empty, the trees still, but the sense of dread remained. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the woods and away from whatever was stalking them. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin, isolated and surrounded by miles of forest, was their only refuge. For now, at least. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the woods, a single, sharp bark, almost mocking in its tone. Mark's blood ran cold. The coyote was still out there, and it hadn't gone far. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its presence, a dark force watching them from the shadows. The barking stopped as quickly as it had begun, and once again, silence descended on the cabin. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance, the terror evident in their eyes. Whatever was outside, it wasn't natural. It had mimicked human behavior, followed them with a deliberate purpose, and now, it was waiting for them to make the next move. Mark stepped back from the window, his heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. They couldn't stay here forever, trapped in the cabin while the creature circled around them. But going outside, venturing into the woods, was a risk he wasn't willing to take. For the rest of the night, they stayed close to the door, keeping watch, waiting for any sign of the creature's return. But the woods remained quiet, almost too quiet, as if the very trees were holding their breath. By morning, the tension had lessened, though the fear lingered. The sunlight felt weak, its warmth doing little to dispel the cold dread that had settled in their bones. Mark knew they couldn't stay another night. The coyote, or whatever it was, would come back. And next time, they might not be so lucky. Without a word, they packed their things and left the cabin, the sense of relief only coming once they were far from the woods, far from the creature that had followed them through the darkness. But even as they drove away, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the coyote's eyes were still on them, watching, waiting. And there you have it, 6 chilling stories of creatures that mimic the most terrifying parts of human behavior. From the eerie skinwalker encounters to the disturbing mimics deep in the Ontario woods, these tales have left us all wondering, what's really out there? Which story creeped you out the most? Let us know in the comments, and if you've ever had your own terrifying encounter, we'd love to hear it. You're a special part of this community, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, it really helps the channel grow. And before you go, check out more spine-tingling videos right here on the channel. Stay safe, and remember, the scariest things are often closer than we think.